Good morning, good morning. Thank you so much for having me here, and certainly thank you for putting on the headsets so that we can unpack the science of how we learn. In the brief time that we have together this morning, what we want to talk about together is what works in teaching and learning. What's fascinating about this area is that there's been a virtual explosion of research over the past 30 years on how the brain works and how the cognitive architecture of the human brain works together to produce learning. What's fascinating about this research is that while we have mountains and mountains of research on how learning works, we struggle, all of us struggle, in how to implement that research into our classrooms. How many of you, by a show of hands, have had a situation where you taught somebody something on a Monday, or maybe you interacted with a colleague on a Monday, and then the very next day, they forgot everything that you talked about the day before? And so that's a problem. And so how can we take what we know about how learning works, how can we take that learning and make it visible, and then use it in our classrooms to amplify our impact on students? That's our goal. And so we have a learning intention this morning. Take a quick look. And it's these powerful influences, it's these findings from the research that are going to allow us to rethink, reevaluate, and reimagine what we do in our schools and classrooms. What's fascinating about all of these findings is that they transcend any border. They transcend age groups. They transcend content areas. It's part of who we are as human beings and how we learn. The trick is, how do we leverage this in our classrooms? So when we're done in about an hour, I'm going to ask you to take a look at these success criteria. We'll see if we've had a good time together in the next hour, if we can do the following. Explain, identify, and integrate. But here's the challenge. This is a lot easier said than done, because there are often barriers and pitfalls that we fall into, because what we think we know about how we learn is very different from how we actually learn. Now, this is not meant to be insulting, but oftentimes as adults, we forget what it was like to be a student and learning something for the very first time. And so we make some assumptions. We draw some conclusions that aren't supported by the research. I want you to take a look at these statements about learning. Here are some statements about learning in general. Just take a look at these for just a second. These statements here, I left something out. There's something important I need to tell you. These statements right here, some of these statements are true statements. They really are how we learn. Some of these statements are false. They're absolutely not true at all. The challenge you're going to have in the next couple of minutes is to try to sort these out. Which of these statements on the screen are true? And which of these statements on the screen are false? Now, the best part of this is you have some neighbors to work with. So I want you to take about 2 minutes, maybe even 3 minutes with your neighbor and talk through these statements. Do you believe that they are true? Or are they false? And maybe why you think that. So you have about 3 minutes to move through the list, true or false, and maybe why. I'll keep a watch on the time. Talk it out with your neighbors. You have 3 minutes. Go. 1 minute, about 1 minute. All right, if you'll pause right there. Say thank you to your neighbors. So let's look at these. Which of these are true and which of these are false? So let's try one. If it's true, give me a thumbs up. If it's false, give me a thumbs down. Individuals use only 10% of their brains. True or false? So I see some mixed responses, right? Here's the truth to that one. That is completely false. Completely false. We use 100% of our brains. Now, it doesn't mean we use 100% efficiently. If you are a teenager, if you've ever been a teenager, if you're around teenagers, or if you know a teenager, bad news. That's their 100%. So let's look at another one. Some individuals are right brain, while other individuals are left brain. True or false? Absolutely. I would even argue that statement is complete garbage. There's no research basis for it at all. It's just not true. We use both sides of our brain in almost every single task. It is not true. And so we could move down each of these, but let me jump right to the point. There are only 2 of them on that screen that are true statements. The rest of them are false. They're just simply not true. For example, individuals learn better when they receive instruction in their preferred learning style. Not true. Not true. We don't even know learning styles actually don't really exist. Now we have preferences. Like I prefer one thing over another, but in terms of learning styles, we all pretty much learn the same way. We just have different preferences. Some people like Nike, some people like Adidas, some people like Reebok, some people like it hot outside, some people like it cold. Those are preferences, but not necessarily styles. And then this one, of course, is my favorite. If I give students 8 million things to read and ask them to solve 24 million math problems, does that make them a better reader or a better math student? And the answer is no, no. And so what do we make of this? What do we make of this? We want to zero in on these 2 right here. Because while they are true, there are some exceptions to this. What happens if it's too challenging? What happens if it's not challenging enough? What happens then if we let them kind of flounder in a problem rather than providing them with the supports they need? How do we make this visible so that we can do something about it? And so that's really where our focus is going to be. And I want to share with you 3 big ideas. 3 big ideas. How many? 3 big ideas that we're going to kind of tackle here together. Number 1, knowing how learning works guides us in rethinking how we teach. If I understand how human cognition works, if I understand how the students in my classroom are learning, and I can make that learning visible, then it will help me rethink how I teach. It'll help, hopefully, you rethink how you set up your schools and support your teachers in their classroom. Knowing how students learn helps us rethink how we teach. Here's the best part. When we rethink how we teach, it causes us to reevaluate the strategies we use in our classrooms. Because if I know more about how they learn, then I need to think about what I'm doing in classrooms to see if that really does lead to better learning. Because there are things that we do in our schools and classrooms that look good, sound good, and maybe feel good, but have 0 impact on student learning. And so we've got to reevaluate what they are. And only after we rethink and reevaluate can we then reimagine what teaching and learning looks like. And that's in the face of young adults doing amazing things, our first keynoter of the day. How do we deal with technology? And how do we embrace technology in a way that works? And how do we make sure that we address the whole child and not just whether or not they can solve math problems? And so that's how this is going to unfold. So let's start with rethinking. And when we talk about rethinking, I want to share with you 4 promising principles behind how learning works. Now, these are things that have stood the test of time. They are part of this 30 to 40-year body of research that says this is how humans learn, this is how our students learn, and we can start to drill it down into what we refer to as promising principles. Now, why would we call them promising principles? Because we love to talk about human brains. And we love to talk about the brain and learning. I mean, that picture's cool. The problem is, how many of you in your schools have fMRI machines or PET scans? How many of you have neurodiagnostic equipment in your schools? Yeah, I don't either. So while that picture is awesome and it's super cool, it's completely useless to us as teachers. It doesn't tell us anything. Is it good to be red? In the United States, the answer is no. Is it good to be blue? Do you want all of this yellow? This means absolutely nothing. So how do we get to the bottom of this? How do we figure out what learning looks like, sounds like, and feels like? And so we have to take these studies and pull out of them promising principles. And so there are 4 promising principles that I want us to uncover, because these promising principles take the neuroscience research and they say, you know what? This might be a principle behind how learning works, but here's the other catch. How many of you in the room recognize that your school, by a show of hands, how many of you in the room recognize that your school is unique? Absolutely. How many of you, although you believe students are similar in a global sense, a room full of 28 over here are very different than a room of 28 over here? But here's the cool part. The principles are the same. How they look in translation is what's different. So 2 schools can be using the same promising principle. The same what? Promising principle, thank you. And have it look very different because of who's in the room. So these promising principles are the cement, the foundation for what we're doing. There are 4 of them. How many? 4. And we're going to walk through them, and I'm going to try to give you a way to remember them. Because the trick is, when you leave here, you want to remember these things. So let's start with promising principle number 1. We only remember what we encode. And so in order for something to even have a chance at making it through the model, now you saw a picture of this model from the previous speaker. You had coming into the brain, you had the short term, you had working memory, you had this model. This is the encoding part. So encoding, so if you would do this. This is encoding. Turn to your neighbor and say, this is encoding. You can say Espanol, this is encoding. Right? So we only remember what we encode. If we don't encode it, you don't remember it. Period. The other day I was leaving the house to go pick up dinner at Chick-fil-A. Now, or KFC. I was in Cartagena yesterday, the walled city, and there was a KFC. I was very excited. And my wife, as I leave the house, hollers to me to pick up something else on the list. But I didn't write it down. I didn't think about it. I just kept walking out the door. So do you think I remembered it when I got to KFC? No. Because I did not what? Encode it. So show me encoding one more time. Encoding. Excellent. So once we encode it, here's the second principle. Once we encode information in the brain, once we encode information in our cognitive architecture, we're not done. Because if we don't do something with it, it'll disappear. So once we encode it, we have to practice retrieving it. We have to practice retrieving it. So this is our indication for retrieval. If you would hold out a hand just like this. This is retrieve. Show me retrieve. Show me encode, and then retrieve. Excellent. So that's the second promising principle, retrieval. But then there's this interesting one. It's this idea that we can only take on so much information at a given time. And then our brain gets overloaded. And so it's trying to teach a student everything they need to know about math in 5 minutes. Or teaching them everything they need to know in the humanities in 30 seconds. Because too much, too fast, it won't last. Too much, too fast, it won't last. So our gesture for that one is really simple, and that is you got to slow some things down. So show me too much, too fast, you got to slow it down. Show it to me. Yeah, so show me encoding, show me retrieval, and show me slow it down. Yeah, we got to slow it down. The world comes at us so fast that it overloads our brain. Here's the last one. And this will be the one we end with in our time together when we unpack it. And that is, learning is hard and takes time. The most effective encoding in the human cognitive architecture is when things are difficult. Nobody likes this one. Nobody likes this one. Students don't like it. Teachers don't like it. We don't like it. But learning is hard and takes time. It's called productive struggle. What's it called? Productive struggle. And so our signal for that is this. Show me productive struggle. Thank you. Productive struggle. Show me slow it down. Retrieval. And encoding. Excellent. So before we do anything with this, we now have to rethink what we know about learning. The true and false questions made us rethink it. And now that we have these promising principles, we have to rethink what we know about teaching and learning. The idea that students have to encode it a certain way, that they have to retrieve it, that I need to slow it down, and that it should be a struggle. I want you to take about 30 seconds or so, maybe even a minute with your neighbor, and I want you to review the 4 promising principles before we reevaluate what we're doing in our classrooms. So take about a minute, review the 4 promising principles, use your gestures, and then we're going to add the next layer to this. You have about a minute to practice. Go. All right, pause right there. Show me encoding. Encode, good. Show me retrieval. Excellent. Too much, too fast, it won't last. That's where we need to slow it down. Good. And the last one is productive struggle, or learning is hard, it takes time. Absolutely. And so we have to rethink what we know about learning so that we can reevaluate what's happening in our classrooms. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to move through each of these 4 promising principles, each of these 4 ideas, and look at what needs to happen in our classrooms if we're going to capitalize on these ideas. In other words, how do we translate the research into practice? So let's start with elaborate encoding. Elaborate encoding is this concept that we only remember what we encode, but we only remember if we encode it a certain way. Only if we remember or encode it a certain way. And there are 3 parts to elaborate encoding. So I want to walk through those. There are 3 things that are needed to elaborately encode information. The first one should come as absolutely no surprise to any of us. If we want the learners in our classrooms to elaborately encode anything, there has to be some level of motivation, right? The task that we give them, the experience that is designed for them to engage in, the learning opportunity in front of them must be motivating. We don't pay attention to boring things. We don't like things that are boring. And so how do we make sure that we design a task, a learning experience, or create an opportunity for learners that gives them a sense of autonomy? They get some choice. There is a level of relatedness. In other words, they see that the learning is relevant. It's authentic. It's important to them, so they can relate to that learning. And last and certainly not least, it's something known as cost. In other words, motivation comes when a student says, you know what? If I do this, I don't have to give up other things that are important to me. Ooh, that's important. I don't have to give up other things that are important to me. Those three ingredients are what motivate learners to engage. Do I have a sense of autonomy? Am I related to this content in some way that it resonates with me? And number three, if I choose to engage in this task, what's it going to cost me? What's it going to cost me? So motivation. The second thing that has to happen for elaborate encoding is something known as multiple representations. Now, this one is a fine line to walk. What we mean when we say multiple representations is the learning has to come through different modalities, because we like multiple modalities. We love images, we love words, we love talking it out, we like acting it out. You had a good time doing retrieval, even though you may have pretended like you weren't having a good time. You were all smiling when you were doing it. And so we like to have multiple representations. So instead of just getting math in words, do we get it in pictures? Do we get to talk to our peers and our colleagues? Do we get to act things out? Do we get to explain things out? Are there multiple ways of representing something in our mind? The third component needed for elaborate encoding is this idea of finding and applying patterns. Our human architecture, our cognitive architecture, likes it when we discover the pattern and we then apply that pattern to something else. This is very different than just repeating patterns. When we give a student a list of problems, so we hand them a handout and we say, here, do these 9,000 problems, they're not finding and applying patterns. What they're doing is repeating patterns. Repeating patterns, we don't really like that because we go on autopilot. And when we go on autopilot, we don't encode. But when we have to find and apply patterns, now we're rolling. Now we're going to see a bump. And so these three things have to be there for elaborate encoding to happen. Is the student motivated to engage? Number one. Number two, is it presented in multiple representations? And number three, are they finding and applying patterns on their own? Is there an element of discovery? And so let's reevaluate this in our classrooms. As principals and directors, how will you help ensure that your learners have opportunities to elaborately encode? It's the difference between an experience and a worksheet. It's the difference between simply sitting and getting information versus going and finding information. So how will you help ensure that learners in your classroom are elaborately encoding it? Because if we don't elaborately encode it, we're not going to be able to retrieve it. Which, by the way, leads us to the second big idea. So the first one was encoding. What was the second one? Retrieval. Now watch this one. This one's super cool. So if you would, hold up your pointer finger. Hold up your pointer finger. This one here. And so when you learn something, right when you learn it, that's the best time to ask about it because you've just learned it, right? But what happens is, so if you hold your finger up, what happens is that over time, if we don't do anything with it, we forget. It's called the forgetting curve. So watch this. Here we go. Do the forgetting curve with me. What happens? Over time, it just goes, and you can't really do that without making a noise. So if you hold it up, you just kind of down it goes. So show me the forgetting curve. Yeah, that's what happens. So a student shows up in our classrooms and we teach them something or they learn something and they're doing really well. And then they walk out the door. The clock's ticking. Because now, over time, it goes down to this. Now, we've known this since the late 1800s. We just don't really pay attention to it. It's the whole idea of one and done. But this is known as the forgetting curve. Wouldn't it be nice if we had the opposite of a forgetting curve? It turns out we do. We do. And I want to show that to you right now. Check this one out. Now I'm going to give you just a moment to take it in, and then I'm going to ask you to do something with it. Now check this out. This is our traditional what? Forgetting curve. But look what happens right here, and right here, and right here. That's an opportunity for students to retrieve. And retrieve. And what happens when students retrieve is that we see this forgetting curve become a remembering curve. It becomes a remembering curve, which means we have to build in opportunities for students to make their thinking visible so that we can see, did they encode it? Are they remembering what I need them to remember? And if not, what is it that we need to encode a second time? Or what is it we need to go back and visit? But if we don't ask this question, we typically don't find out until the test date, and we realize nobody remembered anything. Wouldn't it have been much better if we'd have known days ago or weeks ago and we could have done something about it? It turns out this phenomenon has a huge impact on student learning. In fact, this is one of our promising principles that has a huge impact on student learning. Big effect. Grande. The effect size is 0.65. It's known as spaced practice. So you practice a little here, and then you practice a little here, and then you practice a little here, because what it does is it tells you where our students are making progress and where they are not making progress. It makes their learning visible. And 0.65, you ready for this? Means we almost double the rate of learning in our classrooms. We almost double the rate of learning in our classrooms. So as we reevaluate what we're doing in our classrooms, my question to you is, this is what I have to ask myself on a daily basis. Am I giving my students an opportunity to practice, and am I spacing it out over time? A little here, a little here. Ooh, go back and get this concept. Ooh, a little here, a little here. And there's one more I want to show you. So in addition to spacing it out, there's something known as deliberate practice. Oh, and it does double the rate of learning. It doubles the rate of learning. So what is deliberate practice? Deliberate practice is when you practice those things that weren't encoded very well. So I'm not going to practice just anything. I'm already good at that part, so I'm not going to practice that. But instead, I need some work over here, so I'm going to deliberately practice that. And it doubles the rate of learning. Doubles the rate of learning. And so let's do some reevaluation. How will we, as principals and directors, support deliberate and spaced practice in our classrooms? How will we ensure that students have the opportunity to practice? Oh, and by the way, we heard about it this morning. Practice it in a way that failure is seen as a good thing. It's a good thing. We want them to make mistakes, because when there's a mistake, we now can address that mistake. Mistakes should be valued components of our classroom. Failure is new learning. And as she pointed out this morning, that's exactly what Edison said with the light bulb. That's exactly what he said. He said, I did not identify 10,000 wrong ways. I just found 10,000 ways not to do it in the future. That's a very different way of thinking about it. Practice helps get there. So as you reevaluate, what are we doing in our schools and classrooms that gives students a chance to practice? And are we making that practice visible so that we can see where additional support is needed. Now let's add the third one. So we have encoding, we have retrieval, and then we have what? Slow it down. Too much, too fast, it won't last. It's a concept known as cognitive load. How many of you, and I want you to be very honest here, because this is an experiment. This is an experiment. Are you ready? How many of you have reached a point in your morning already where you're like, I have too much information coming into my brain? Yeah, how many of you have had it's just too much? You're sitting here going, I can't take it. I'm going to have to either write everything down or I'm just going to have to pretend like I'm paying attention. That's your cognitive load. That's your brain telling you too much, too fast. It's not going to last. It's not going to last. Because cognitive load describes for us the weight or source of pressure on that working memory. In other words, we only have a limited amount of space in our working memory. And so if you were to take these math problems, right, and you were to look at these math problems, and I asked you to do them in your head without any paper or pencil, could you do it? But if you had paper and pencil, how many of you could tackle these problems? Yeah. Because the paper and pencil reduces the pressure of having to memorize or remember everything. So working memory is a fixed value. We have a fixed amount of working memory. Now we can change it. We can add working memory. We can do all kinds of things to make our working memory larger, but in the end, it is a finite space. And so when other things take up working memory, not related to school, then it eats up all the space. Watch this. Here we go. Extraneous cognitive load. That's the stuff that has nothing to do with the learning. It could be a fight that occurred. It could be food scarcity. It could be something going on in the hallways of our schools, but it's not related to the learning. It's extraneous. Intrinsic cognitive load is how hard is the stuff we're teaching. How hard is the stuff that we're teaching? For example, reading Shakespeare has higher intrinsic cognitive load than reading Roald Dahl. But what happens if we don't manage this and we're not careful about how we set up our classrooms, we exceed working memory and we overload students. So you might say, well, then let's just back off of the intrinsic cognitive load. Let's just back off of it. So then you create this situation where we've minimalized what's going on outside the classroom. We've adjusted our content in class to make it a little smaller chunked material. But look what's there now. That space that's unfilled, come on. You know what they're going to do. They're going to fill it on their own. It's called boredom. And it will create major problems in our schools and classrooms because guess what? They don't have enough to keep them challenged, so they go find other things to challenge them. This is when you see empanadas being thrown across the cafeteria. Why? Because they're bored. What we want to do is find this nice balance. Life outside the classroom, the content, and that germane cognitive load, those are the strategies and techniques that we ask them to do in the classroom. That's the elaborate encoding. That's the retrieval practice. That's what we mean when we say germane. That's what our classrooms are all about. We want space for them to be actively engaged. So then the question becomes, how will you minimize extraneous cognitive load, monitor intrinsic cognitive load, and maximize germane cognitive load? How will you make sure we're not trying to squeeze too much into a single class period? because then that's going to lead us into the last part of this. Now, I want to zero in on one thing really quickly. This is important. I want us to hang this, grab a hold of this, germane cognitive load. That's what we ask our students to do. Take notes, complete a Venn diagram, fill out a graphic organizer, engage in a classroom discussion. Those are things we ask them to do. That's the germane cognitive load. Because this next idea is all about that germane cognitive load. It's productive struggle. What's our signal for productive struggle? Productive struggle. So let's talk about productive struggle. What does that mean? It turns out that what we're really after, what we really want, is something known as productive failure. Now hang tight. I didn't change the name on you to be mean. I just thought telling you productive failure at the beginning of our talk, before we really knew each other, would be off-putting. But what we really want is productive failure. In other words, we want mistakes. We want missteps. We want them to find and experiment with their learning. And so it means they need to not succeed the first time, but instead make those mistakes over and over again and get that feedback. Productive failure has a high effect size. It has a very high effect size. It is not good when they have the answer the first time. In fact, if they're getting the answers the first time through, it begs the question, why are they even here? So what causes or what can we do for productive failure? There's some really good research on productive failure, and there are 5 components to productive failure. And remember, this has to do with germane cognitive load. Remember, I asked you to grab that concept from the previous idea. Germane cognitive load, that's where we set up productive failure. Now, what is productive failure in our classrooms? Number 1, do we give students, and you've already seen this before, you saw this in the previous speakers, complex problems that are challenging, the right level of challenge. And we put them in those complex problems and we provide minimal support. And when I say minimal support, I don't mean we leave the room. And I don't mean that we don't answer their questions or that we turn our backs on them. It just simply means, hey, here's a problem I would like you all to take a look at. Now I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to talk amongst yourselves and come up with solutions for this problem. Come up with anything you can. How do you think you might address this problem? Talk it amongst your peers. You can look things up. You can go ask questions. But I'm going to give you time to develop possible solutions. And then after you have time to develop those possible solutions, I need you to go around and ask other groups of students what solutions they came up with, and let's lay them all out on the table. Let's put them all out on the blackboard. Let's put them all out on the interactive whiteboard. Let's lay all of the solutions out and start to compare and contrast these solutions. And then that's when we step in. That's when our teachers step in. That's when our colleagues step in. Because now we give feedback about those solutions and help students find the optimal solution or solutions to those problems. That's productive failure. Giving them a chance to struggle or wrestle with the alligator is what we would often say, before jumping in and rescuing them. That's what we mean when we say productive failure. Unproductive failure would be a complex problem, minimal support, no time for solutions, no collaboration, and no feedback. It's like throwing a child in the deep end without a life vest. My son and daughter play soccer in the United States. And so I got them Colombian soccer jerseys yesterday. And it reminds me of how we prepare soccer players in the United States. We often throw them in impossible situations. We put them into soccer programs because, the United States, when you say football in the United States, it means something totally different. It's ridiculous, right? We take a bunch of people, we put them in equipment, and we have them just crash into one another, and we think it's a good idea. So I'm talking about football, your football, our soccer. And what's interesting is you cannot take a soccer player that's just starting out and put them on the Colombian national team and say, productive struggle. The guy yesterday said we should do productive struggle, so go play soccer with the Colombian national team. That's ridiculous. That's not what this is. What this is put them just outside their comfort zone, just outside their level of challenge, just outside their zone of proximal development. That's what this is all about. But the feedback matters. So I want to show you this mechanism for feedback, and then we're going to start to wind down our time together. Because the last 15 minutes, I want to show you how we tie this all together. But practice testing effect size is 0.40. It's a high effect size, but I want to show you how this fits with productive struggle. Because the idea is that if we want to give them feedback, we need them to be involved in this feedback. We can't just give feedback and it come from us. They have to be involved in this. So I want to show you the practice testing effect. This is one of the major influences on student learning. You've seen several: deliberate practice, spaced practice, elaborate encoding, productive failure. Here's another one to add to the list. In practice testing, we give students a test that is like the one they will really take. But it's not for a grade. It's not for a grade. We cannot grade it, because if we grade it, it's no longer practice. You with me? If we grade it, it's no longer practice. But instead, we ask them to engage in what we call error analysis, where we tell them which questions they got right and which questions they got wrong, and then we ask them to organize it on this grid. I'll let you take in the grid. So the students would then sort the questions that they got right and the questions that they got wrong based on this grid. So for example, were there any questions that they got correct and it surprised them? Now, we've all been here in our own studies where we've answered a question, we got the feedback, and we got it right, and you're thinking, did I really get that correct? It shocked you. Now, that may be a good thing, but it needs to go in its own box, because it means I need to come back and visit it, because I may have gotten it right by accident. But either way, I got it right. Then there are questions that I got correct that I'm confident in. Like, I got it right. And if you ask me again, I'll get it right again. So we're not going to engage in deliberate practice here. We're not going to engage in spaced practice, but I need to put it on the radar screen, because if I wait too long, what's going to happen? So you can't wait too long, but you can wait longer than some of the others. Now, this is my personal favorite. Incorrect and clueless. This means I got it wrong, and I'm going to get it wrong again, and I'm going to get it wrong again, and if you ask me 28 times, I'm going to get it wrong 28 times. So quit asking me. Instead, give me new learning opportunities. Because now the thinking is visible, and we now know where we need to devote our time. There. I got it wrong, and I have no idea what I'm doing, so help me. This was me through my entire career, because I would take tests very quick, and I would make mistakes that if I would have taken a moment and paused, I wouldn't have made that mistake again. So while I may have gotten it wrong on this assessment, it's not learning that I need, it's study strategies and study skills that I need. So then as teachers, I'm not going to reteach that. Instead, I'm going to help the student engage in metacognition, self-regulation, self-evaluation, and get them to slow down. This makes their thinking visible so that we can do something about it. This is what we mean when we say productive struggle or productive failure. So then the last reevaluation. What kind of productive failure or productive struggle do you promote in your school? And how do we help our teachers create productive struggle and productive failure opportunities in our schools and classrooms? How do we design experiences in our schools and classrooms that allow students to mess up and not be penalized, but instead mess up on something and be supported in where they go next in their learning? This is productive failure. This is productive failure. So as we start to wind down, I want to shift to the last part or the third theme that comes with this conference. I have to tell you, when the invitation was offered for me to come down here, I was thrilled at the theme. Because I think coming out of COVID, and I think what's happening in the world, and it was articulated so well by the first three speakers. I was even entertained by the one speaker that referenced Donald Trump, and everyone in the room looked in my direction. And so I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you, but Donald Trump, no bueno. But we have a chance to rethink what we do, reevaluate our schools and classrooms, and reimagine what this is going to look like for the next generation. And the research behind it should fuel this rethinking, reevaluating, and reimagining. We know how people learn. We know a ton about how people learn. And in fact, we even know promising principles and practices that have a record of showing incredible growth in learners. And here's the best part, as I said earlier, and I'm going to say it again, it transcends boundaries. In other words, we cannot find in the research that we do how changing countries changes how learning works. We haven't found it yet, and we have looked. Oh, have we looked. Crossing an international border does not change the cognitive architecture of the human brain, because that's actually what unites us. And so how we do this is a global effort. We're in this together. And so I want to share with you some big ideas that move away from worksheets, textbooks, and handouts, and more towards what we know about effective teaching. And we've studied groups of teachers all over the world. And what's interesting is that it turns out that when you take effectiveness and experience and you put them side by side, they are no longer related after 5 years of experience. Here's what that means. Experience and effectiveness are correlated for the first 5 years of our career. That means a fifth-year teacher is more effective than a first-year teacher in the research. But after 5 years, that effectiveness falls apart. That experience no longer relates to that effectiveness. In other words, a 26-year veteran may not be as effective as a 10-year veteran. Or a 27-year veteran may be way more effective than a 5-year veteran. In other words, they're not related. So experience doesn't seem to be the predictor. It doesn't seem to be the predictor. And unfortunately, some of the research has indicated that teaching, and you know this, we've all been, this is the story of my life. When we get to 7 years, we plateau. We plateau. That's what the research says. So what separates effective teachers from teachers that aren't as effective as they want to be? Because I would argue every teacher in your building, every teacher I encounter, because I can tell you when my feet hit the floor, my goal is to be effective. Nobody gets out of bed in the morning and says, you know what? I think I'm going to dial it in at about 40% today. So how is it that we can unpack this a bit more? It turns out what separates teachers that are highly effective from those that want to be highly effective has to do with how they think about their role as a teacher. It's not what they do, and it's not who they teach. It's how they think about who they teach and think about what they do. Here's what I mean by that. It's all about the thinking. If you want to be an effective teacher, it turns out we have to do several things. I'm going to share them with you right now. Number one, we have to constantly strive to evaluate our impact on student learning. In other words, my goal should be every day to do something and then look to see if it worked. As an instructional leader, as a principal and a director, same thing applies to us. What I do in my schools or what I do in my building, do I look to see if it worked? If we do, it triples the rate of learning. Triples the rate of learning. The second thing is having high expectations. The belief that they can and that they will. And you heard that this morning from Allison. She said it, it was incredible. She crushed it. Because she's basically saying, believe that we can. Turns out, it more than doubles the rate of learning. More than doubles the rate of learning. The other thing is that we need to collaborate on things. Closing the doors in our classrooms and just kind of hanging to ourselves is a bad thing. Instead, let's collaborate. Let's work together and say, what is it you want out of your learners? What does it mean to be a good learner in your building? What does it mean to be a good learner in your classrooms? And then now let's work together to get here. So we need to reimagine how we do schools. I need to do this. In the schools that I work with, in my own classroom, I have a tendency to just close the door. Just close the door. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. My colleagues are going to do what they're going to do. And that is in contradiction to what the research says works. We have to constantly try to find the right level of challenge. Because there's a fine line between productive failure and unproductive failure. There's a fine line between productive struggle and unproductive struggle. And if we miss it, we're going to know it because it turns into frustration and ticked off learners. We have to make sure that we welcome mistakes, that mistakes are both welcomed and valued. Right answers, good for them. Wrong answers, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity. But you got to do something with that opportunity. I have to do something with that opportunity. We have to do something with that opportunity. We should also seek out feedback. We should constantly seek feedback. And last and certainly not least, we should make sure that there's a balance between surface learning and deep learning, or to pull from the previous keynoter, we need to make sure we balance between knowing and understanding. I would add one more. We need to balance knowing, understanding, and doing something with the content, skills, and understandings. That's the balance we have to strike. It's not what we do and who we teach, it's how we think about our teaching. Do we rethink what we know about teaching and learning? Does that cause us to reevaluate what we do in our classrooms? And when we make thinking and learning visible, and we can see it right in front of us, does it cause us to reimagine what our classrooms look like? Does it cause us to reimagine what we do on a daily basis? And so as we start to wind down, I want to make sure we check in to see if we've tied the knot here. Have we woven this together in a way that makes sense? So let me ask you, instead of I can statements, I want to show you these in the form of can I questions. So if you remember when we started our time together, it said we can explain. Now the question is, can we explain? Can we identify? And can we integrate? With a neighbor, I want you to take about 2 minutes and go through those 3 questions and see if you can indeed answer them now based on what we've done over the past hour. You have about 2 minutes, and then I promise I will wrap up our time. 2 minutes, talk it out with your neighbors. See if you can answer those can we questions. 2 minutes, go. Take about another minute. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this. What are we going to do with what we know about teaching and learning? What I hope to have conveyed in the last hour is that we know a lot about how learning works. We looked at 4 promising principles that came directly from the research on cognition and neuroscience. But knowing those principles is very different than applying those principles in practice. And applying them in practice requires us to make sure that teaching and learning is visible so that we can see if those practices had an impact. It's the only way we're ever going to move from research to reality, from intention to implementation, from potential to practice. And so are our students better off today than they were yesterday just because they spent a few hours with us? That's at the core of what we do. That's at the core of what you do. And so with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.